tonight, Layla, who was last here during the 2019 election, if I remember rightly.
Right. We all thought it might get easier after that point, but it didn't, did it?
Didn't, no. And since then, as chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on COVID, has run to be leader of the Lib Dems, and didn't succeed.
No.
And are you now the Lib Dem spokesman on Foreign Affairs? Right, Layla, COVID.
Yes.
Where the hell are we going?
Oh, God. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to see you all. It really genuinely is. And can everyone hear me all right? All right, lovely. Well, no, it really is lovely to see you. And thank you, first of all, for almost all of you wearing your masks, because the Conservative Party opposite me don't, notwithstanding Sajid Javid yesterday at the press conference suggesting that we all should. And in fact, the guidance always said that we should. And it was really important. And so where are we now? And what I might do is just stand up so I can see some of the faces at the back, if that's all right. Where are we now? I'm not going to lie, I'm quite worried. I'm worried about where we are now. And the reason for that is because all the numbers are going in the wrong direction. The thing that's better compared to this time perhaps last year is, of course, the vaccination programme has been rolled out. It started very well. Unfortunately, however, it has stalled, and there's another effect that's come into play, which is that everyone who was vaccinated very early on is now suffering from a waning of the efficacy of that immunity. And that means the combination of high numbers of cases and waning immunity, particularly among the more vulnerable, plus an NHS that is completely overwhelmed already. We've already seen in Oxford people being turned away on days from the JR, and that's already happened. That happened last month. So we are in for a pretty rocky Christmas period, I'm afraid. And so I thank you all for doing your bit. And I'm afraid to say my prediction is it's going to get worse. Now, there's ways, of course, that the whole country can help towards making it slightly less worse. But actually, I don't think the onus should be on people. I think the onus should be on clear messaging from the government. And the government are not being clear, not least by not showing people by example what they should be doing. I mean, it's all very well, give people the choice, but show them what good looks like. And good does look like having, if you are in a room, make it well ventilated. If you're in a school, give the schools the money to put in proper ventilation in schools. That's beyond opening a few windows. And incidentally, in the middle of winter, in some of our schools that haven't had investment for a very, very long time, opening a window isn't very good for the health of the children. And there are units that you can install in classrooms to filter the air and make it safer. All of these things and many more, we are all used to them. There is no new thing. The antivirals are certainly helpful, but are no silver bullet. Neither ever was the vaccine. The thing that we should have done, and the thing we should have done before, is you keep cases low until you get to the point where you have a full understanding of what living with COVID really means. Living with COVID does not mean pretending COVID doesn't exist, which is currently, it would seem, the strategy of the government. And they're desperate not to bring in so-called Plan B. And I have been calling over the last couple of weeks, actually, for them to do that. Because the one thing that we've learned over and over again, and I say we, and I mean we, not them, is that if the numbers start going in the wrong direction, no matter how slowly, you act decisively and you act quickly. And that is how you avoid future strife. And all those bereaved families of the nearly 140,000 people who have passed away from COVID deserve a better government than the one we have now. So I chair the All-Party Group on Coronavirus. I convened it last summer. The idea being to help the government to push them towards listening to the evidence and learning lessons, not just from this country and our eminent scientists who are feeding into this debate, but also from abroad. I'm sorry to say they don't always listen. At points we have pushed them, particularly on borders, and I think that was probably our greatest success was really pushing the government on protecting our borders and making sure that the airports were secure. But more recently, we are now doing so badly that the Italian Prime Minister yesterday pointed at the UK, and England in particular, and said that's a really good example of how not to run a country through COVID. So I'm sorry to report that the government doesn't seem to be listening, but that will not stop us. We will continue to hold them to account. And a big part of that is also helping to vaccinate the world, because this is patently true. We've seen this over and over again. We were the original Alpha variant, right? Alpha came from Kent. But since then, we've seen other variants emerge. The one we're most worried about now is not just Delta, but there is a new Delta, an offshoot of Delta, which looks like it's going to overtake Delta. And there may yet be others. In fact, it's highly likely, according to SAGE, the government's own scientific advisory group, that is likely to happen. There are going to be variants that are going to continue to disrupt this recovery. And all I've ever wanted is for the government to succeed. And that is a very difficult thing for an opposition MP to say. But hand on heart, and I'm sure you all agree, all we've ever wanted is for them to succeed. And time and time and time again, they've seen what's happened in other places and they haven't followed through here. And vaccinating the world is that final step that we need to take. And when people say, well, when is it that we're going to get back to normal? Well, it's when the continent of Africa has more than 4% of people vaccinated. Because until you get those variants under control, then we can't be sure that our own efforts aren't going to be undermined by the fact that we didn't help others elsewhere. It's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
What's the APPG? What is it? People may not know.
Sure. So an all-party group initially it was set up as a mechanism for cross-party working, and this is 4 and a bit years in, and it's very much how the nuts and bolts of Parliament works. And you don't achieve very much, especially from the backbenches, unless you get groups of MPs together of like and similar mind, and you work together across party and across houses in order to make change. So we set up this group. I'd been members of groups like this before. This is different, incidentally, to the select committee system. Okay, so you've got a select committee system which is embedded in Parliament. It is the scrutiny side of Parliament. I used to sit on the Public Accounts Committee, and they hold a lot of sway. And these all-party groups, actually, some of them were never meant to hold much sway. They were more like social groups for MPs. There is an all-party group for the Cayley, for example. Okay, but some of them are actually very effective at influencing policy, and I would argue the APPG on coronavirus has been one of the most successful ones that's been set up. The secretariat of it is an organisation called March for Change, and they were one of the organisations that were an offshoot from the People's Vote campaign. Some of you may have dealt with them in the Brexit times, but it's full of really good, smart people. And we actually didn't want a sort of party political divisive thing anymore. What we wanted was to bring everyone together, have conversations, have hearings, and we've had some incredible people in front of us, including people like David Nabarro from the WHO. We had Neil Ferguson the other day, and we are working with some really incredible people on all sides of the house, including people I never thought that I would have day-to-day dealings with, like Norman Tebbit is on our group. Karen Brady is on our group of The Apprentice fame, and very influential in the Tory party in getting people over. We've got Dan Poulter as well as the Tory MP. And we're currently speaking to people like Gordon Brown on the vaccinating the world point. So we have pretty wide reach, and what we've proven to be is another place where the public can go and see in a transparent way what is the debate, what are the different sides of the debate, and then we're very, very open about how we come to the conclusions that we come to, and we publish everything that we do.
Does the government listen to you? Has Matt Hancock been to see you? Has the Sarge been to see you?
No, they wouldn't. And actually, generally, you can get ministers to all party groups, but they tend not to, especially if they are telling them the truth that they don't want to hear. So I'm not entirely surprised. However, yes, we are very influential, and there have been points where, for example, we were one of the first groups very early on to raise the other strategy that actually should have been followed, which was the elimination strategy, which we called COVID Secure UK. And what that meant was that we would have driven cases downwards all the time. You are constantly looking to keep cases as low as possible, and you protect the health and the wealth of the nation. And I think on things like the debate around health and wealth, the government has tried to sell it that the reason why we can't protect people is because we want the economy to carry on. By doing one, you stop the other. Well, the way they do it, that is true. But actually, if you look at countries that early on adopted the elimination strategy, like Australia and like New Zealand, over the 2-year course of the pandemic, they have fared much better in their economies. And the reason for that is because they very rarely had to have lockdowns of the entire country. Australia had a few, but by and large, their economies did not shut down. And as a result, this country is 5% behind in its GDP over the course of the 2 years, whilst New Zealand are ahead by 5%. They've stalled this year, but they stalled last year, and this year they've grown. And the aggregate of the two is what you need to look at. So the government slightly massaged these figures. They say now we've bounced back in a big way. Well, I'm afraid to say you have to take the course of the entire pandemic together to see the effect of what they've done versus the effect on the economy. And you just have to ask, people who are running the pubs locally, how many times have they had to chop and change what they've had to do? The consistency of an approach that would have carried us through the entire thing was better for businesses in other countries that did this. And when they then opened up, so places like Denmark, we heard in our hearing last week, there are countries in Europe that have fewer restrictions than us now. But the reasons why they haven't seen the huge spike in cases is because they kept those more in place for much longer. And what we were hearing from the representatives from places like the WHO was that, frankly, they'd earned the right to have those freedoms. And as a result, they are not seeing the spikes that we are having now. And I'm deeply concerned by the direction we're going in. I don't, for what it's worth, think we're going to have a Christmas like the last one. I sincerely hope, because the vaccination program has been game-changing. And we have to give credit where credit's due. And by the way, that credit is to the NHS. Because it's locally, that rollout has been absolutely managed by the local NHS. They've done an absolutely incredible job. And I have to say, it does stick in the throat rather, when Nadeem Zahawi back when he was vaccines minister, and now Maggie Thrupp claim credit, because I was seeing on the ground what they were doing here locally. And I have to say, they've done an absolutely incredible job and absolutely deserve our thanks for what they've done.
And the public inquiry, where is that?
Well, according to the government, it will start in spring. Mm-hmm. It can't start soon enough, as far as I'm concerned. And the reason for that is twofold. And I should say, a public inquiry is not about blame. It's really important that it's not about blame. But it is about truth. And then it is up to the people who are watching it and the people who will commentate on it to draw their own conclusions of blame. And as a result, I think it's incredibly important that it's set up as soon as possible so that it reports before the next election. Because this has been an extraordinary challenge, and I absolutely accept that, well, we kind of did see this coming because it was top of the risk register, and there's a lot to be said around the preparation before COVID, and I think we covered some of this when we did our virtual meeting, didn't we, John? But in their response over the last 18 months, it is important that, first of all, we get on top of what actually happened. There are some people who dispute the numbers. They claim that not as many people died of COVID as actually did. So we need to make sure that we have a common baseline about what those numbers are telling us. And then we need an assessment with all the evidence available of what happened to social care, what happened to the NHS, how was the support for businesses put into place, why were the excluded group excluded for as long as they were, and many still are. What happened, what actually happened, who made what decision, and where does that buck stop. But it needs to be done by, in my view, a judge. It needs to be done with several work streams, and it needs to start as soon as possible, because we need at least some of this work to have been done before the next election, because I think people deserve to know how well the government did in an objective way before they cast their vote at the next election.
Who's Boris talking to about chairing it? Do you know?
I don't.
But the whole point is that no public inquiry takes a year. You know that. You know, the child abuse, everything else takes years. So the whole point is to go beyond the next election, isn't it? So that if any odour is to hit the fan, it won't hit the fan before the next
Well,
election.
that's what he wanted. But I think there's going to be, and for exactly that reason, I think politically it would be very bad for the government for any kind of interim findings to come out before the next election. However, when polling's been done on this, 2/3 of people in the country want something before the next election, an objective assessment about COVID from the government before they decide how they vote at the next election. I think it's incredibly important. And their response, and there are things that they will have done well, and there are things that they will have done less well. But to have that forum for particularly the bereaved families, John, because the very first people that we spoke to in the all-party group were the very distraught families of those people who died early on. And now it's just been more and more and more. And it's beyond just what happened in care homes. It's now, you know, what is happening in schools and how that's filtering up through the generations. There are people who are going, I'm sorry to say, pass away now as a result of the government not keeping cases low through this winter. And they haven't, I don't think, been transparent about how many of those deaths they are willing to take responsibility for. So I think the only way to get to the bottom of this is going to be some kind of truly independent public inquiry. We'll see. I think there is a lot of pressure, incidentally, for them to do it. And I don't yet, and whilst he may want for it to be pushed to one side, actually, if they've got a really good independent chair, they could well decide for themselves how they do it, which would include interim reports. And yes, the inquiry itself may well take a long time, but it will be up to the chair, if it's truly independent, to decide how that happens.
Is that Jim Naismith's hand? No, no, sorry. Oh, Alan, sorry, yes.
Hello,
I want to ask a question.
Can I ask you about whether there should be a local review of COVID? Because the council seem that decision partners seem pushing back about doing anything local. And I think there's certain lessons to be learned and lessons that shouldn't be learned. That there needs to be a local review as well.
So Dr. Alan Cohen asked you whether there should be a local review.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That's the first I've heard anyone bring it up, actually. So it's an interesting one. I'm all for genuine reflection on how well a system performs.
I'm a member of the Health Committee.
Right.
We walk up at every meeting and we wash down each time by the system.
That's interesting. What I have seen, and this is from the perspective of throughout most of the pandemic, they were briefing, generally it was myself and Annalise together, and with our public health director, with whoever was in charge of the vaccine rollout, leaders of councils as well, and they were working through a mechanism called the Local Resilience Forum. And I know you know this, but just to explain for everyone else how it was working. From my perspective, actually, probably there were things that, again, they could have done better, but most of the time they were just reacting to what was happening at the national level. I wonder if actually the way to do it is when the public inquiry, the independent public inquiry happens, that the role of local government is one of the strands that it looks like, that it looks at. Because the actual grunt work of what happened through COVID was done by our councils and by our CCGs and the local NHS trusts and indeed GP practices. So to ignore that part of the system, I think wouldn't make sense in the context of that inquiry. And I wonder if that's how that will come out. I'd be very surprised. For example, test and trace. So there are some parts of the country that decided to have a completely locally run test and trace system. Oxfordshire decided that we would set one up, but we would not take over all of it because we had a resource problem, frankly. We didn't think we'd be able to train people up fast enough. And the way we've ended up doing it has been pretty efficient. Our numbers are, in terms of how many people we reach in the proportion, one of the highest in the country. So we've managed to navigate that pretty well. But there are other parts of the country that didn't do that. And we need to understand why. And we need to also understand why did some places manage to do it better than others. And throughout the whole pandemic, I was really shocked by how little best practice sharing was being facilitated across the country. Where there were places that were doing things well, and by the way, Oxfordshire a couple of times was one of them, I was actively raising it in the House, mainly so my other colleagues could hear what else was going on, and we were pinpointing all the different things that we were doing. I have to say, one of the reasons that we were quite successful in Oxfordshire is because there were times when the entire system, and this is, by the way, absolutely not party political, because we had a mixture of leaders of councils who were Conservatives, Labour and Liberal Democrat, and indeed Green, and they were all working together as one through the whole of the pandemic. And there were times we decided, actually, the numbers are going in the wrong direction. The government doesn't want us to sound the alarm, but we're going to anyway. And we did, and what we saw was that we got ahead of it before other places had huge rises. So we were able to act in a way that was united and independent occasionally of government. And I think that was one of the lessons of the pandemic, where you had all political voices acting as one. You had really strong messaging coming out to the community of what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And that paid dividends in our death rate.
So I'm sure I'm sure Richard Peter want to ask a question in a minute. Let me ask you, the university has an early testing centre across the road. Mm-hmm. I tried to get them to test locals. I got one big raspberry on that. It sees 6 people a day if they're lucky. It's there doing nothing. Should they not be more community-minded about that?
I don't think it's up to the university.
It's the NHS, they say.
Yeah, it is, exactly. I think that's a decision for the whole system about what they need to do. There were times when we were pushing at various points for Oxford to have, and it was called all sorts of different things. At one point it was a tier system. So this time last year, do you remember the tier system? Mm-hmm. So we were pushing actively to go into higher tiers. And we managed to get the city in at points, and then the rest of Oxfordshire ended up following. More recently, we ended up in emergency response, again, because of agitation from the system, because we were seeing a spike, and they did introduce local testing, where people could just drop in, and that was being held down by Park End Street, so just behind where the Royal Mail was. As it happens right now, they can't offer it because the NHS isn't being given the ability to do that. They're literally being stopped from doing it.
Richard, you want a question of COVID? Professor Richard Peter, if you did.
No, I don't think I'll just keep talking later.
All right. Any other COVID questions? Yes, Liz.
Yes, thank you, Layla, and thank you for the work that you do. Just on the local end, partly because you've been in the thick of it and heard this for so long, looking into your crystal ball, had the government, had we had a different government that had given the money right from the outset to all our public health systems and had supported the NHS to use their own public laboratories locally and use the very well oiled emergency systems that have been set up in the last more than 100 years. Do you think we could have kept control of this better than we have? This is the find, test, trace, isolate, and support.
Yeah.
All of this. Would that, with the money and the will given from national government to local government, would we have made a better fiscal than we have?
So, from the evidence we took on the all-party group where we looked at this, where it tended to have better outcomes, and that is to say more people tested, more people traced and identified, and indeed supported, and actually the support bit has never been done particularly well, I don't think. Yes, you end up getting on top of cases. And this is why, £37 billion earmarked for the test and trace system. The resource was there. And so it wasn't just about money. So the question is, if we were putting that much money into this, why didn't it work as well as it should have done? And my answer to that, from what I've observed, is it's partly because central government doesn't tend to trust local systems to solve these problems. But had we taken it all on at the same time with no government support, I think it would have collapsed. And so actually the answer to the question of, is it one or the other? Well, actually, I think it was always going to be both, where you give a lot more money to local public health directors and their teams, who, by the way, have been, over the last 10 years, systematically depleted. And it's one of the things that we've seen a consequence of now. It also explains a little bit the question, well, if other countries are doing things, why aren't we doing things the same here? The answer to that question, which I've asked directly a few times, is because we just don't have the people in Whitehall who have those connections in other countries, you know, that you make by going to conferences and just working together on papers or whatever it is, to pick up the phone to say, right, this is coming down the tracks. We've lost a lot of those connections, which is a real shame. And I hope that through this, we're going to see the value of public health, and rather than just keep reorganising it, actually fund it properly and give it the resource that it genuinely needs. But I don't think, and we've had this discussion before, so I know you know the answer, I don't think that just having it all completely locally controlled was the answer, simply because when I've asked our public health director, is that what he wants? His answer is absolutely not. He needed the support to draw from. What he would have liked, and what the whole system would have liked, was the respect to have a bit more autonomy about how they did it, because each part of the country and each community is actually pretty different. What works here in North Oxford is not what is going to work in parts of East Oxford, where you've got really high communities in deprivation. It's just, you have to have a slightly different approach. And we've tried to do it within the parameters given, but the same principle applies across the country. And for a while, I do think the government didn't listen to what local areas needed/wanted, and didn't give them the autonomy that they needed. And yes, I do believe we would have had better outcome.
Other COVID questions? Peter Stalker.
Part of this what you're talking about there, what's the perception within your group of the World Health Organization? Either in terms of capacity, responsibility, networks of governments, should we be optimistic, pessimistic, legal ways to stand up?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, in terms of the politics of the WHO, it definitely did not help that at the same time that this pandemic was happening, we had Trump in the White House. Because Trump was fundamentally undermining a lot of what the WHO was doing, mainly because he doesn't really believe in global systems of any type. He doesn't want that. He's a nationalist and populist, and he wants America first, was literally his motto. And he felt that everything could be dealt with in that way. The reason why that's important is because a lot of the funding that they were getting stopped very quickly, and they found themselves floundering about, you know, where are we going to go in order to get the resource that we need to respond. So that's an observation. In terms of my direct dealings with anyone from the WHO, actually what I've noticed is whenever they've spoken to us or engaged with us, they've done so in a fairly balanced way, in a more balanced way actually than many of our scientists who are homegrown, because they're seeing how it's developing across the world, and their job is not to judge, their job is to help. But at points they have been also bewildered by why the country didn't follow their advice sooner. You know, and a good example being face coverings, which is now just so ubiquitous. But from quite early on, when we realised that this was airborne, and you know, again, we've got some brilliant people locally, Trish Greenhalgh and others, who were at the forefront of pulling together the papers on this. But the WHO made recommendations on face masks and ventilation in particular. And ventilation in schools being a really good example of something the WHO recommends that we still have not implemented in this country, and we should. So my view is when the WHO recommends something, it has such tortuous processes before it's allowed to make any announcements. When it intervenes in something like this, especially in a pandemic, which is by definition global, it is something we should be listening to and acting upon. And they've absolutely gained I had respect for the WHO before, but seeing them respond to this, they certainly have my confidence. Are there problems with the organisation? Is it too unwieldy? Does it occasionally, we know it has its own politics, and then I really do hope we get to the bottom of what happened in Wuhan, because I think fundamentally that is undermining the credibility of what the WHO knew, didn't know, and certainly what that delegation went out and what they were allowed to find out. I'm not blaming the people who went on the delegation, but I do think that there's problems with what they came back with. That said, if they tell me to do something, I'm going to do it, because by and large, they have been right.
Are you surprised that SAGE has only met once a month since the summer?
I'm really shocked. I'm really, really very shocked by that. And I haven't fully understood the reasoning.
The government said they don't need their advice, have they?
Well, but yes, I don't understand that. Because this is still developing, this is still very complex. And in fact, it's very hard to model this right now. It's actually harder to model the virus now than it was at the beginning, because we have so many more variables that we need to incorporate into the mathematical models, not least waning immunity, different types of jabs, and how people have fared through the pandemic itself. So I don't understand why you wouldn't, as a government, want the whole might of science at your right hand when you are making decisions. They are saying that they are listening to Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, although just in the last 24 hours there does seem to be suggestions that they are recommending that we go to Plan B, and the government are pushing back, which, given the history of the last 18 months, I don't think that actually Vallance and Chris Whitty are particularly hawkish. I think I'm more hawkish than they are. I think they have been really balanced, and arguably too balanced, certainly at the beginning. Right at the very beginning, they got all the MPs in one big room, which of course is a terrible idea now, but we didn't know about airborne transmission then. And Chris Whitty was talking about how, you've got to be careful when you lock down, because there is no way that people would adhere to any of these restrictions for any length of time. When we then questioned where this information came from, where's the study, where's the example from elsewhere in the world where this is true, it is not true. And we've proven it not to be true. And in fact, the resilience of the British people and their ability to actually, when they are given good information and told categorically what they ought to do, by and large, the vast majority of people have done it. And so I think that's an example of where Chris Whitty was perhaps slightly less cautious than we would have wanted him to be. So if Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance are telling the government to do something, that's probably at the limit of when you should do it. You should at that point perhaps be questioning, should we have done it slightly earlier?
More COVID questions before we move on to Richard, yes.
One brief comment. You talked about waning immunity, and I think it's clear that there is waning immunity against infection. But if you look at the studies of the effect of vaccination on serious disease, hospitalisation or death, there seems to be very little waning immunity. It seems to be the non-fatal cases, the not so serious cases that are going through. So, these are going to spread the infection. But if you look at all the studies at the moment, there's still more than 90% protection against hospitalisation or death. That does seem to be lasting. Contrary to that, the Israelis are telling that there's breakthrough even on hospitalisation and death.
Yeah. And I think the problem, it's true, but the other problem, and of course, those of you who study things or are close to it, or in fact anyone who's been following this over the last 18 months knows that a very small percentage of a very large number is a really large number still. And that's the problem. We've let cases go. And if you have 100,000 a day, and there is a tiny proportion of those that are going to end up dying. So I think we have not broken the link. Our public health director locally has said that to me many times. The link is not broken, but it is weakened. Absolutely it is weakened. We are in a different place to where we were last year, without a doubt. But the strategy of the government to essentially let it rip will mean that that small proportion of people who are still double jabbed and ending up dying in hospital gets bigger because you have more people who are being infected. And that's just logic.
Good question. We always talk about vaccination in this country and double jab without saying which vaccines we're talking about. But in the original trials, the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna and Pfizer, were actually more effective
Yes.
than
the AZ.
one, the
Yeah.
AstraZeneca one. And the size of these mRNA vaccines weren't adequate to vaccinate everybody. I mean, without using the AstraZeneca one, we couldn't have got widespread vaccination. It isn't as effective.
That's right. And that's one of the things we're suffering from now,
Yes.
is that we were using AZ earlier, and the AstraZeneca one is the one that started slightly less effective, but seems to have also declined more than the other. So that is what the booster program is actually about. It's about topping everyone up, because they recognise that actually the early success, and that's why the mix and match is what they are recommending, that everyone who started with AstraZeneca now gets a Pfizer. And that's why.
Yes.
Can we move on from COVID unless anybody's got... Yes, Bob Whedon.
Kind of a comment, which I was in the Jews to do the sugar and so on. And I heard someone say, COVID ended in June.
Mm.
And I thought, there I was there. It didn't.
COVID ended in June.
COVID ended in June.
Yes, in the Judy of school, yeah? After how many pints?
Friends of mine, I'm not going to interfere, but that's during my own subjective.
Yeah.
My child, if that's an example of what a lot of people or a crucial number of people think, or shows their ignorance or their desperate hunger, I think that's telling.
Very, very. And actually, overhearing... Absolutely, absolutely. Overhearing conversations in pubs is actually a really interesting way of... No, it's true, because there will be people who just, it's that off-the-cuff comment that actually quite often will reveal, in vino veritas, but, will reveal what people really think. And the reason why a lot of people felt that way in the summer was because that was essentially what they were being told by the government. They were being told, get back to work. And they were being told, and all the signals from the ministers themselves, the representatives of the people, whose job it is to keep them safe, was, it's fine. And I think the question I have now, and it's a genuine question, is when there is a proportion of the population, I never, by the way, stopped wearing my mask at any point, and in fact, where I've been able to get hold of them, I've upgraded, because if we all wear face coverings, we're protecting each other. But when only some of the population is wearing a face covering, then actually at that point I need to upgrade to a PPF2 or a PPF3 if I can get hold of it, because at that point I feel I need to protect myself. And the signal that masks were giving was that it's not over. And it's not, and I think it's worth acknowledging something that I don't, we need to accept that at some point, coronavirus will be something that we have in the yearly jab. I had my flu jab yesterday, and maybe it'll be something that will just get incorporated in that. And people say, well, we have a flu jab every year. There are people who die of flu every year. Isn't coronavirus just like flu? Well, it absolutely isn't. It's much, much more deadly. But also we know much, much less about it still. So until we get to a point where that level of risk is low enough, then better safe than sorry. And I think fundamentally the mistake the government made was signalling that it was over. Because the reason that lady or gentleman, whoever you were overhearing, thought that is because that's what they were being told.
You were in the Commons earlier on today. Sorry, Bob. How many Tories are wearing masks in the Commons today?
The ministers were, finally.
Yes.
But I would say of the ones who were there for questions, about a third. On the opposition benches, we've generally kept our masks on throughout, because I feel it's important to set the example. And
one comment it's sort of COVID related, but it also might move on to another subject. But actually, in 2020, this country had the same number of deaths from tobacco as from COVID. COVID was not bigger than tobacco. And tobacco's been doing this every year for decades, and it's going to keep on doing it. And the age distribution of deaths, actually, the tobacco ones, although it's mostly old people, on average it's slightly younger than COVID. So I know it has got this sort of acute emergency side to it, but over decades, it's still running about 100,000 deaths a year. It's still running around 20,000 deaths a year in the UK.
which is why public health is so important. And I don't think we should accept that. You know, I actually personally, and I say this as an ex-smoker, I was grateful for government intervention when the prices started going up, and I felt that, you know, I actually think that there is a place in public health. And I say this also as a liberal. And I feel like, you know, you do, government, there are points, especially when you've got very high numbers of deaths, where government support, so support services, very often people who are turning to substance abuse of some form, of which, frankly, nicotine is one. Why is it that they're doing that? And if they can shut down some of the positive reasons to do it, i.e. I was doing it when I was young because there was peer pressure, because I was sat in the pub drinking pints, everyone else was smoking, and I felt like I kind of had to fit in. These days, it's the complete opposite. And actually the pressure from young women seems to be different pressures to do with body image and things like that. So I think it's important to address the underlying reasons. But I don't think the argument that, well, X number of people die of this, so why don't we just let them die of the other thing? That's just double the number of people dead. I don't buy the argument.
One more quick question on COVID, then we'll move on to death.
Just a comment for my question about the differences. Largely, tobacco seems to be produced themselves in a bit of people. I didn't know the big difference between that and what I was going to say, what has bothered me, I don't know if there's anything you know about it, is what I have painted is that most of the things that you've been told to do have been put across, protect yourself, protect yourself, it's been very selfish. I mean, I'm not saying that's wrong, but they're included in masks. And everything that I have read says that you wear the mask primarily to protect other people. It has a small effect for you, but a bigger effect for other people. So this idea that people can choose is terribly unfair, because the people who don't care are being protected by the people that are wearing their masks, and the people that would like other people. I mean, I would like the message to be put across that this is that you wear a mask to protect and help other people, so that it became something which was
Altruistic.
socially acceptable. I mean, you're talking peer pressure. So if you were wearing a mask, the general feeling was that you were in fact being selfish, rather than.
But I will just defend, though, there are some people who literally can't. And I think we certainly don't want to create a sort of pitchfork society where if someone's not wearing one, then, you know, they automatically get sort of booed or hissed at or whatever. I think we've got to be careful. But I agree with you. And actually where mask wearing was at its height was when that message was coming out loud and strong from government. And that you are wearing a mask to protect others. And I noticed that was actually one of the strongest messages that they used. I felt it was there was one point where it was very strong, and that message, I think, was coming across. But since then, the message has been, well, you don't have to wear a mask, and you should. So I remember the bit I remember, and I think this is the bit that's just utterly ironic, is they said, well, you don't have to wear a mask, but it is courteous if you do so. And then none of the Conservatives in Parliament were doing it. And yet, we had staff in Parliament who were young, by the way. So a lot of the staff in Parliament, sadly, it's not a very well-paid job to work for Parliament, and they're young. and they found themselves in a position where they were wandering the halls not vaccinated, and you had all these MPs, average age 50 and above, who were jabbed, double jabbed even, sometimes before the young people had had their first. And that felt like it was very discourteous indeed.
Let's move on if we can. You've all been checked out by Thames Valley Police. You're here today and other people. So we're living in this very strange situation post-Amos. How do you read it? I mean, are you physically afraid?
No. And, look, I did think through 3 or 4 times, is this really necessary? The argument that comes from the police, and I should say Thames Valley have been absolutely fantastic. We are very lucky. I speak to colleagues elsewhere in the country, and they weren't as responsive at all, London most notably. But the colleagues I speak to around Thames Valley, both the MPs of all sides, have said that we could not fault them. They've been brilliant. I didn't know David Amos, but he was the kind of constituency MP that I admire, who was, did stuff like this, who was very part of his community and held surgeries and was available, and in many ways, there were obviously political things we would have disagreed on, but actually fundamentally I think he took his job seriously, he loved his job and he loved his community, and that is what an MP is meant to be there to do. And I think what struck me most about this one, more than Jo Cox, so Jo Cox I found deeply personally upsetting, I think because, she worked here in Oxford for so many years. I didn't know her again, but I identified with her perhaps a bit more than David Amos, and roughly similar age, and, so I saw her death when I was still a candidate as actually being the question of me asking myself, is this worth it? And I think as a human, anyone would do that. If you go into the armed forces or if you go to the police or whatever, you will have those conversations with your family who are quite rightly worried, and it's taken as part of the job. But I don't think it is a recognised part of the job of an MP to put your life on the line for the job. However, I did have to ask myself those questions when Jo Cox died, and I didn't have to ask them for very long, but it's important that you have that discussion with yourself when you're thinking about a life change that you want to make. The thing that struck me about the David Amos tragedy is that I think he would have been someone who absolutely felt safe doing what he was doing. I suspect, and we will find this out more, that had he been given all the advice in the world and all the panic buttons and everything else, he would have said, I don't need that, very old-fashioned style of being an MP, and I want people to be able to look in the eye, whites of my eyes and ask me a question and I will answer it, and that would have been his style. And so I think for this, I really, really hope that what we don't end up with is a situation where we are forced to have uniformed guards in front of our surgeries. I think that would be really, really damaging. Some of the people, and I would say especially the people that I need to see face to face, are people who are distrustful of the system in some way, and that includes the police. So you end up seeming unavailable to the very people that you want to help. And I sincerely hope that the conclusion of all of these reviews is not going to be to do that. That said, and they're not outside the front here, but I think they're worried about copycats. And so in the weeks from, for the next couple of weeks, I'm certainly going to just follow the advice of Thames Valley Police. I've spoken to the superintendent, because one thing I'm really worried about is I don't want resource being directed towards me when it should be going to solve county lines or dealing with something else, or indeed the spate of stabbings that we've been seeing around Oxford very recently that have been deeply, deeply worrying. And so the other thing that I'll be pushing for is if Priti Patel and the Speaker, in their assessment, decide that the police have to be even more involved, that they are given the resources to do that so that the community doesn't suffer as a result of resources being not misdirected is wrong, but directed towards us, when in fact, personally, if I had to choose, should an armed police officer be coming anywhere near, uniformed police officer be coming here, or going to patrol around, say, Pinnock's Way, or, somewhere in East Oxford where they're worried about a particular family or whatever, I'd choose them over me every time. And I think this is why the police has to be the ones to decide the level of threat. Because if I choose, I will always choose the other over myself. And therefore I am biased. and I don't think it should be up to MPs to decide. I think it should be up to the police to decide.
Well, there were a couple of policemen earlier on at the back.
Oh, I missed them. I was so engrossed in the question. I missed that they were-
8,000 majority, Layla. How do you make sure you keep that?
Well, through COVID, making sure we get back to as many people as possible, regardless of what it is. And I have to say, the sorts of issues that we were hearing through the pandemic were everything from businesses going under to bereaved families, to frontline workers who were mentally absolutely at their wits' end. And my fabulous team, who are based down in Abingdon, two of them are here and I'm going to embarrass them, but they do an absolutely incredible job. Because we have had tens of thousands of people asking for help, and we've done our best to respond. Obviously triaged it, so apologies if you're someone who's had an email back, but it's been perhaps slightly shorter and a bit longer in the waiting if it was something to do with, let's say, honeybees or whatever. And it's not that the environment's not important, perhaps we'll come on to that in a moment, because that is absolutely an emergency too. But we found ourselves with, and I occasionally compare, anecdotally, these things aren't ever written anywhere, and it's very hard to compare how much you get as an MP compared to others. But Oxford West and Abingdon does have, I've yet to find another MP who has more, it ranges what it is, I should say, so it's not all, and it's not the best way of measuring it as well, because you could have half the number of cases that are 3 times as difficult, so I don't think it's the best measure necessarily. But I do have a huge amount of correspondence, and I love that. And I think the way I keep that majority is to maintain that high level of service. And I've had a number of people come back as a result, and doing things like this and feeding back and campaigning that we do, who say, I don't agree with your politics, and I voted for Brexit, and I'm normally a Tory voter, and actually this was a lady in Cumnor the other day, but I vote for you because I think you do a good job locally. And that to me is the biggest compliment I can get. So all I can do is my best and then hope for the best.
Brief answers to some big local issues, the LTN and traffic. Where do you stand on that in North Oxford, in Jericho in particular?
In Jericho in particular, well, how do I do a short answer on that? The basic principle of it is that whatever is done needs to be done in proper consultation with the local community. And I think that's where I'm going to stop. Because actually from there on, what happens next is up to, I think it should be the local community. It has stalled somewhat at the moment, and my concern is that traffic levels up Walton Street are now pretty much back to where they were pre-pandemic. So we've seen what it's like without the cars coming. We've now seen what it's like post-pandemic, back to sort of normal level of service. I am supportive of the move to try and traffic calm generally across the city. I think this is really important, not least because it leads to lower air pollution. You talk about smoking. Well, actually, one thing that we did do with smoking is make it absolutely socially unacceptable to light up in front of a child. But there are more children now who die of air pollution than there are who die of passive smoking from cigarettes, and yet we still haven't gotten on top of air pollution. So I am supportive of lowering the speed limits, as annoying as it may be as a driver, and I understand that, but I do think it's the right thing to do. Linked to that, I'm very supportive of what the New County Council is trying to do to actually get people out of cars completely. There isn't much money in the coffers of local government, and if the magic wands, if I had 3 wishes from the genie as an MP, I think one would be to restock the coffers of local governments of all colours across the country, because I think that they have done an excellent job and have proven how excellent they have been through the coronavirus crisis, and they deserve that cash injection. Because actually, if we are going to really deliver for local communities, if you really want to take the levelling up agenda, if you really want to do that, the best thing you can do, the best investment, I think, is to give it back to the communities through local government.
Okay, another local issue, the boatyard, we're right in the centre of it here. Coming up to planning in a month's time, no bridge, no big piazza, a community centre that will be just fitted out, and social housing not there. What's your view on that?
The social housing is unacceptable completely. The bridge, I haven't spoken to the EA and the Women's Trust about this, but my understanding is they put in objections because it's dangerous. And actually, I don't understand if there's a way around that and on what basis they're saying that. So on that, I'm going to go away and do more homework.
Canals and River Authority does as well.
Yeah, exactly. I would like to see the logic for a bridge is obvious, I think, to all who use these paths. It's obvious, but then when you say it's dangerous, then that sort of falls over. So you need to. I want to better understand why they're saying that, and if there is any kind of alternative that we can fundraise for.
But isn't this a last chance saloon for the boatyard? We can offer 20 years.
I think we've got to get it right. And I think I'm very supportive of the groups that have come together to push for these things, because the worst thing I think that can ever happen is, any kind of development like that goes through and local community's voice wasn't heard. If they can't do a bridge, the onus is on them to fully explain from A to Z why they can't do it. And my concern always is when things like this happen and no one says anything, and then after the fact, they then say they didn't like it. We may yet be in a position where there's many aspects of this that we don't think is the best, but I do really applaud anyone who's got involved with this, because I think it's really important that we have our say.
Any local issues? Anyone want to raise a quick question? Maggie, did you have your hand up?
My issue is not local.
Is it?
Okay.
Go on.
Okay. Well, I just, as you're the spokesman on foreign affairs, it would be interesting to hear what your priorities at the moment are, very briefly, and how you can take it forward in the parliamentary context.
Oh, thank you. So there's a couple, and one is pretty local, actually, which is Afghanistan and the consequences of that. And there's various levels of consequence. Some are way beyond my pay grade, which are the big geopolitical implications of what happened and why. But then there are some that are far closer to home, which is, of course, linked to the numbers that we have welcomed, quite rightly, into Oxfordshire. And so I'm keeping a very close eye on that. I'm arranging a visit to go and meet some of the families as well. I'm working closely there are various community groups. And much of this, incidentally, I'm sure many of you are aware of Asylum Welcome, but Asylum Welcome is kind of coordinating a lot of this. And so anything that I can offer as help to the coordinating efforts, including sort of prodding councils where necessary. But I should say the councils have responded admirably. And the problem in Oxford, of course, is housing stock, as always, and back to the social housing and everything else. The biggest comments that I've had are people saying, well, I've been on a council house list for so long, and did I need to have been flown over on a plane? I mean, you do point out that their lives were literally at risk, but it's not an easy argument to make, and you don't want to sound facetious when you're making it. It's a very legitimate question. So how is it that we make sure that they are supported? And personally, I think we do have the capacity to take more, and I think we should, because people's lives are at risk. But pushing the government on this right now is tough. There's obviously been the change at the top as a result of Afghanistan. So now it's Liz Truss. I have yet to have a questions with her. I think that's coming up next week. So I'll have a chance to quiz her about that. The second is closer to home. And by and large, it's the consequences of, and the B word, the Brexit word, is the past, but there are very definitely consequences of the deal that the government has struck now for Northern Ireland, also geopolitical, but also very practical, freedom of movement, meaning that we just don't have the same levels of social care staff and nurses, especially here in Oxfordshire. So looking at the consequences of what's happened and its impact on the resilience of market forces, which in many other countries have managed to dampen the effect of coronavirus, because what the government says is that it's all coronavirus and all countries everywhere are having these same problems. Well, unfortunately, that's just simply not true. And if you look at our European cousins and you ask them, do you have issues with fuel getting to your forecourts? They're expensive, so the price of fuel is actually nothing to do with the HGV driver crisis. But no, they have not had that. And it's not just panic buying. There was a genuine shortage at one stage of fuel, and it was caused by the lack of HGV drivers. But also linked to that is availability of products in supermarkets and the effect on supply chains. And again, we have not seen, and this is not just anecdotal, this is also from governments of similar countries, notwithstanding the issues around coronavirus, we have not seen the same level of issue there than here. And the reason why is because for a very long time, we relied on immigrant workers to come and be a valued part of our economy. And the same people that we were clapping every Thursday are the same people that we are hoping to attract back. And so we need to look at how do we do that. And there's very real consequences if we don't, as I say, not least, and very, very important, linking right back to coronavirus, I'm afraid, social care. The reason why the JR was closed to new admissions at A&E and they had to be taken elsewhere was because there were not enough beds being freed for people to be able to go into social care. So the effect on social care has a direct impact on the NHS, which feeds right back into coronavirus, but it's the other way around, I'm afraid, not that way.
Last question for you. People ask me to ask you, what do you mean by pansexual?
So it's a word that I discovered online. And I think with these words, people get fixated on the words. And actually for me, it just means that I love my partner for who they are. And I think that's just what love is. And it just so happens that she's a woman. But that explained to me at the time why, having had all my life been with men, I suddenly found myself in a relationship with a woman. And I was examining that. I thought to myself, well, is it because I was repressed in some way? Did I just not know I was attracted? And then I had this epiphany that for me, it's about the beauty of their mind. And that's the thing that attracts me. And that's what pansexual means. So I think actually there are a lot of people off the back of that who are like, oh, I understand that. A word is just a word, but it's explaining that concept.
Layla has to go off to serve
Yes, I'm sorry.
a Lib Dem AGM.
It's our AGM. We'll be delighted to know.
But before, would you thank you very much indeed for giving up an hour of your time?
Thank you very much.